In the sweltering heat of July 1850, a man stood alone in a dimly lit laboratory on the outskirts of New Orleans, watching his patient die for the third time that week. Dr. Samuel Thornton had witnessed death more times than he could count, but he had never accepted it. While other physicians in Louisiana resigned themselves to the brutal reality of yellow fever, cholera, and countless other diseases that ravaged the South, Samuel harbored a dangerous obsession. He believed death could be understood, predicted, and ultimately delayed through the power of scientific observation. The humid air of New Orleans clung to everything like a second skin that summer. The city sprawled along the Mississippi River, a maze of narrow streets, elegant townhouses, and cramped tenements where disease moved as freely as the river's current. In the French Quarter, wrought-iron balconies dripped with moisture, and the smell of decay mixed with magnolia blossoms created an intoxicating perfume that newcomers found either enchanting or nauseating. Samuel had grown up with this smell, had learned to read its subtle changes like a language only he understood. At 42 years old, Samuel Thornton was considered both brilliant and eccentric by his colleagues at Charity Hospital. He had studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to his native Louisiana, bringing with him ideas that many local physicians found radical, even heretical. He kept meticulous records of every patient he treated, noting not just their symptoms and treatments, but the temperature, humidity, their living conditions, what they had eaten, where they worked, and dozens of other details that his peers dismissed as irrelevant. His colleagues bled patients and prescribed mercury. Samuel observed, documented, and searched for patterns. The woman on the makeshift bed before him was named Marie Dubois, a seamstress from the Irish Channel, who had come to him 4 days earlier with the telltale signs: fever, headache, muscle pain. By the second day, her skin had taken on the yellowish tint that gave the disease its name. Now, as her organs failed one by one, Samuel sat beside her, holding her hand and recording every labored breath, every convulsion, every moment of her dying with a precision that would have seemed cruel to anyone who did not understand his purpose. Marie's husband, Thomas, stood in the doorway, his face a mask of grief and confusion. He was a dock worker, his hands calloused and strong, yet utterly powerless against the invisible enemy that was stealing his wife. Samuel had seen that look countless times, the desperate hope that somehow this doctor, this strange man with his notebooks and instruments, might possess some miracle cure that others lacked. "Why don't you do something?" Thomas finally asked, his voice breaking. "The other doctors, they at least try bleeding, they give medicine." Samuel looked up from his notes, his grey eyes tired but focused. "Because those treatments kill as many as they save, Thomas. I know this brings you no comfort now, but every detail I record about Marie's illness might help me save the next person, or the person after that. I am trying to understand what we are fighting." Thomas turned away, unable to watch any longer. Samuel understood. He had lost his own wife to yellow fever 7 years earlier, had held her hand just as he now held Marie's, had felt the same crushing helplessness, but where others had moved on, buried their grief and accepted the capricious nature of disease, Samuel had transformed his loss into a singular mission. He would map the territory of death itself, chart its progression with such detail that future physicians would be able to see it coming and stand in its way. Marie died at 3:17 in the morning. Samuel recorded the time, closed her eyes, and sat for a long moment in the silence that followed. Then he opened his notebook and began to write. The room around him was filled with the evidence of his life's work, shelves lined with journals, each one containing hundreds of case studies, observations, measurements. On one wall hung a large map of New Orleans, marked with colored pins indicating where each yellow fever case had originated. Patterns were emerging, slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. As dawn broke over the Mississippi, Samuel walked through the French Quarter toward his home on Dauphine Street. The city was just beginning to stir, vendors setting up their stalls, enslaved people hurrying to their early morning tasks, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops. Samuel passed the cathedral, its spires reaching toward a sky that promised another punishing day of heat. He thought about Marie, about the pattern of her illness, about the 17 other yellow fever cases he had documented this month alone. There was something there, some connection he could not quite grasp, like trying to remember a word that sat just beyond the edge of consciousness. His home was a narrow townhouse that he shared with his assistant, a young free man of color named Jacques Beaumont. Jacques had been studying medicine informally with Samuel for 3 years, barred from formal medical education by the color of his skin, but possessing a mind that Samuel considered sharper than most credentialed physicians. When Samuel entered, Jacques was already awake, brewing coffee in the small kitchen. "Marie?" Jacques asked quietly. Samuel shook his head. Jacques poured 2 cups of the thick, chicory-laced coffee that fueled their long days, and handed one to Samuel. They sat in silence for a moment, a ritual they had performed too many times. "The pattern is there, Jacques," Samuel finally said. "I can feel it. The cases cluster near the docks, near standing water. It spreads faster in the heat. There is a mechanism at work, a natural law we simply have not discovered yet." Jacques nodded slowly. He had learned not to dismiss Samuel's intuitions. The older man saw connections that others missed, even if he could not always prove them yet. "What do you need?" "More data, more observations, and time." Samuel smiled grimly. Always more time. Neither man knew that time was the one thing Samuel Thornton would soon run out of, or that his meticulous records would outlive him by decades, saving thousands of lives he would never meet. The summer of 1850 was particularly brutal. Yellow fever swept through New Orleans with a ferocity that terrified even those who had survived previous epidemics. Charity Hospital overflowed with patients, many of them recent immigrants who had arrived in the city with dreams of prosperity and found instead only fever and death. Samuel worked 18-hour days, moving between the hospital, his private laboratory, and the homes of patients too poor or too sick to be moved. His reputation in the medical community was complicated. Some physicians, particularly the younger ones, sought him out, fascinated by his methodical approach and his rejection of traditional treatments that seemed to do more harm than good. Others viewed him with suspicion or outright hostility. Dr. Nathaniel Crawford, the chief physician at Charity Hospital, belonged firmly to the latter camp. "Your refusal to treat patients properly borders on malpractice, Thornton," Crawford said during a tense meeting in the hospital's administrative offices. The room was oppressively hot, even with the windows open, and Crawford's face was flushed with heat and anger. "You sit and watch people die while taking notes like some kind of ghoul. It is unconscionable." Samuel remained calm, though his jaw tightened. He had been through this argument many times. "I refuse to subject patients to treatments that have no proven efficacy, Nathaniel. Bleeding weakens already compromised bodies. Mercury poisoning adds to their suffering. I keep them comfortable, hydrated when possible, and I document everything so that we might actually learn something useful." "Comfortable?" Crawford's voice rose. "You let them die comfortably. That is your contribution to medicine." "I let them die honestly," Samuel replied. "And yes, I document their deaths, because those records will teach us how to prevent the next death and the one after that. We are fighting an enemy we do not understand, and you want to keep using weapons that do not work simply because they make us feel like we are doing something." Dr. Helena Winters, one of the few female physicians in New Orleans and a grudging ally of Samuel's, spoke up from her position near the window. "The mortality rates speak for themselves, Nathaniel. Dr. Thornton's patients die at approximately the same rate as those receiving conventional treatment, but they suffer less in their final days. And his records have identified clustering patterns that suggest the disease spreads through some environmental mechanism." Crawford scoffed. "Environmental mechanism? Next you will be telling me it is caused by bad air or some other superstitious nonsense. The disease is a punishment, a natural check on populations living in sin and squalor." Samuel stood, gathering his papers. "If you truly believe that, Nathaniel, then there is nothing more to discuss. I will continue my work with or without the hospital's blessing." As he left the building, Helena caught up with him on the street. She was in her mid-30s, tall and striking, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She had trained in Boston before moving to New Orleans to care for her aging father, and like Samuel, she often found herself at odds with the medical establishment. "You should be more politic with Crawford," she said, falling into step beside him. "He has the power to make your life very difficult." "He already makes my life difficult," Samuel replied. "But I appreciate the concern, Helena." "How is your father?" "Failing. The dropsy is worse." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Samuel heard the strain beneath it. "I am treating him as you suggested, limiting the mercury, focusing on comfort. It seems to help, at least with the pain." They walked in silence for a block, the afternoon sun beating down on the dusty street. A funeral procession passed, the third Samuel had seen that day. The mourners' faces were exhausted, numb. Yellow fever had made grief a constant companion for too many families. "I received a letter from a colleague in Philadelphia," Helena said eventually. "Dr. Morris. Do you remember him? He is conducting experiments with mosquito populations and disease transmission in the tropics. His theories are considered quite radical, but they align with some of your observations about standing water and seasonal patterns." Samuel stopped walking, his attention fully focused. "What exactly is he proposing?" "That insects might carry disease from person to person, acting as vectors. It sounds absurd, I know, but he has documented correlations between mosquito populations and disease outbreaks in several Caribbean ports." Samuel's mind raced. Mosquitoes bred in standing water, yellow fever clustered near the docks, and poor neighborhoods where water collected in barrels and ditches. The disease spread fastest in summer when mosquitoes swarmed. It was not proof, but it was a thread to pull. "I need to see his research. Can you write to him?" "I already have," Helena said with a slight smile. "I thought you would be interested. But Samuel, even if this theory has merit, what can we do? We cannot eliminate every mosquito in New Orleans." "No," Samuel agreed, his mind already working through possibilities. "But we can drain standing water. We can screen windows. We can document which preventive measures reduce infection rates. We can build evidence, Helena, one observation at a time." That evening, Samuel sat in his laboratory with Jacques, surrounded by maps and journals. They plotted every yellow fever case from the past 3 months, noting the locations, dates, and outcomes. The pattern was undeniable. The disease radiated outward from specific points, always near water, always in the hottest months. "If Dr. Morris is correct," Jacques said, studying the map, "then the mosquitoes are born in one place and carry the disease to another. They are the connection we have been looking for." Samuel nodded slowly. "And if we can prove it? If we can show definitively that eliminating breeding grounds reduces disease transmission, we can save thousands of lives. But we need data, Jacques. Rigorous, undeniable data." "Then we start collecting it tomorrow," Jacques said simply. Neither man slept much that night. Samuel lay awake in his room thinking about patterns and proof, about the gap between intuition and evidence. He thought about his wife, Catherine, who had died because he had not known enough, had not understood enough. He thought about Marie Dubois and the countless others he had watched slip away. His work had to mean something. It had to add up to more than notebooks full of suffering. Somewhere in those carefully documented deaths was the key to preventing future ones. He just had to find it. August brought no relief from the heat or the dying. Samuel and Jacques threw themselves into their investigation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They divided New Orleans into districts and systematically visited every reported yellow fever case, documenting not just the medical details, but the environmental conditions. Proximity to standing water, number of mosquitoes observed, sanitation conditions, population density. The work was exhausting and often dangerous. Many neighborhoods viewed outsiders with suspicion, and Samuel's questions about water sources and insect populations sometimes sparked hostility. In the Irish Channel, a rough district near the docks, they were confronted by a group of men who accused them of being government agents sent to justify tearing down their homes. "We are physicians trying to understand how the disease spreads," Samuel explained calmly, though his heart hammered in his chest. The men surrounded them, anger radiating from their sweat-soaked faces. These were people who had lost family members, who worked brutal hours for subsistence wages, who had no reason to trust well-dressed strangers asking intrusive questions. Jacques stepped forward, his hands visible and empty. My mother died of yellow fever in this neighborhood 5 years ago. We are trying to help, not harm. We think the standing water in the drainage ditches might be breeding insects that spread the disease. If we are right, cleaning those ditches could save your families." The tension hung in the air for a long moment. Then one of the men, older than the others, nodded slowly. "My 3 children died last summer. If there is even a chance you are right, I will answer your questions." The others gradually lowered their guard. Samuel and Jacques spent the next 2 hours surveying the area, earning trust through patience and honest answers. They documented 23 cases of yellow fever within a 3-block radius, all within 50 yards of a large, stagnant drainage ditch that teemed with mosquito larvae. As they walked back toward the French Quarter that evening, both men were lost in thought. The correlation was strong, but correlation was not causation. They needed controlled experiments, comparison groups, data that could withstand the harshest scrutiny. "We need permission to drain some areas and leave others untouched," Samuel said. "Then we document the difference in infection rates." Jacques looked at him skeptically. "You are asking permission to potentially save some people while deliberately not helping others. Do you think anyone will agree to that?" "They will if we are honest about the uncertainty. We do not know if draining water sources will help. We suspect it might. The only way to know for certain is to test the hypothesis systematically." Samuel paused at a corner, watching a lamplighter make his rounds. "I know it seems cruel, Jacques, but the alternative is continuing to do nothing while pretending we understand. That is the real cruelty." The next week, Samuel presented his proposal to the city's Board of Health. The meeting took place in a grand room in the Cabildo, the old Spanish colonial building that now housed various government offices. The board members sat behind a long table, fanning themselves in the oppressive heat, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Samuel laid out his evidence methodically, the maps showing disease clustering near water sources, the correlation between mosquito populations and infection rates, the theoretical framework proposed by Dr. Morris and other researchers. He requested permission to implement drainage and screening measures in specific test districts while maintaining careful documentation of outcomes. "This is the most absurd proposal I have heard in 20 years of public health work," declared Alderman Richard Beauregard, a portly man with a florid face and an air of absolute certainty. "You want us to spend public funds draining ditches based on the theory that insects carry disease? Everyone knows yellow fever is caused by miasma, by the corrupt air rising from swamps and decomposing matter." "Then draining the standing water should reduce the miasma as well," Samuel countered smoothly. "Either way, improving sanitation in poor neighborhoods can only benefit public health." Another board member, a physician named Dr. Eugene Marchand, leaned forward. "I have read your case studies, Dr. Thornton. Your documentation is impressively thorough, even if I disagree with some of your conclusions. But this proposal would require significant resources. Why should we trust your hypothesis over established medical wisdom?" "Because established medical wisdom is not saving lives," Samuel replied bluntly. "Our treatments do not work. Our theories do not predict where the disease will strike next or how to prevent it. I am proposing we test a new hypothesis using rigorous scientific methods. If I am wrong, we will at least have improved sanitation. If I am right, we could prevent the next epidemic." The debate continued for over an hour. Some board members were intrigued, others dismissive. Finally, they voted to approve a limited trial. Samuel would be allowed to implement drainage and mosquito control measures in 2 small districts, with 2 comparable districts left unchanged as controls. He would have 3 months to show measurable results. It was less than he had hoped for, but more than he had expected. As Samuel left the Cabildo, Helena was waiting outside. She had attended the meeting as an observer, one of the few physicians in the city who actively supported his work. "You did well in there," she said. "Beauregard wanted to dismiss you out of hand, but you made it impossible for them to reject the proposal entirely without looking like they opposed public health improvements." Samuel managed a tired smile. "Now comes the hard part. We actually have to prove the hypothesis." "We?" Helena raised an eyebrow. "I was hoping you might assist. Jacques and I cannot manage 4 districts alone, and I trust your observational skills." Helena considered for a moment, then nodded. My father would approve. He always said medicine advances through careful experimentation, not hidebound tradition. When do we start? Tomorrow, Samuel said. Always tomorrow. Over the following weeks, Samuel, Jacques, and Helena worked to transform their test districts. They organized work crews to drain standing water, distributed screens for windows, and educated residents about preventing water accumulation in barrels and containers. The comparison districts received no interventions, though Samuel ensured basic medical care was available to all areas equally. The emotional weight of the work was crushing. Samuel walked past homes in the comparison districts where he could see water barrels swarming with mosquito larvae, knowing that draining them might save lives but would also invalidate the experiment. Science demanded controls, but humanity demanded action. The tension between these imperatives kept him awake at night, questioning whether the pursuit of knowledge justified even temporary inaction. You cannot save everyone, Helena told him one evening as they reviewed the day's data. They sat in Samuel's laboratory, the windows open to catch any hint of breeze. If this experiment proves your hypothesis, the knowledge will save thousands, perhaps millions eventually. But only if the methodology is sound enough to convince the skeptics. I know, Samuel said quietly. Knowing does not make it easier. Jacques, who had been plotting new cases on the master map, spoke without turning around. 7 new cases in the comparison districts this week, 2 in our intervention districts. The pattern is holding. It was early yet, and the numbers could shift. But for the first time in years, Samuel felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. September arrived with marginally cooler temperatures and mounting evidence that Samuel's interventions were working. The difference in infection rates between the test districts and comparison districts had grown too large to dismiss as statistical noise. Areas where standing water had been drained and windows screened showed 40% fewer new yellow fever cases than comparable untreated areas. The data was compelling, even beautiful in its clarity. But success brought new challenges. Word of the results spread through New Orleans, and residents of the comparison districts began demanding the same interventions for their neighborhoods. Samuel understood their anger, had anticipated it, but that did not make the confrontations any easier. You let my son die so you could prove a theory? A woman named Catherine Morrison stood in the doorway of Samuel's laboratory, her face ravaged by grief and fury. Her boy had died of yellow fever 2 weeks earlier in one of the comparison districts. You had the knowledge to save him, and you chose not to? Samuel felt the accusation like a physical blow. Mrs. Morrison, I did not have knowledge. I had a hypothesis that needed testing. If I had implemented the interventions everywhere without proper controls, and the infection rates had dropped for unrelated reasons, we would have learned nothing. The next epidemic would kill just as many, because we would not truly understand what worked. My son would still be alive. Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. Your experiment, your precious data, you valued it more than his life. There was nothing Samuel could say that would ease her pain or justify his choices. He had made a calculation that trading potential lives now for certain knowledge later was the ethically correct choice. But standing before a grieving mother, the mathematics of utilitarianism felt hollow and cruel. I am sorry, he said quietly. I wish I could have saved him. I wish I could save everyone. Catherine Morrison left without another word, and Samuel stood alone in his laboratory, surrounded by the evidence that his methods worked and the knowledge that they had costs he would carry forever. Jacques found him there an hour later, staring at nothing. The Board of Health has called an emergency meeting, Jacques said gently. They want to discuss expanding the interventions citywide. The meeting was contentious. Alderman Beauregard, who had opposed Samuel's proposal from the beginning, now argued that the results were inconclusive, that other factors might explain the difference in infection rates. Dr. Crawford from Charity Hospital suggested that any benefits came from improved general sanitation rather than mosquito control specifically, making the insect theory unnecessary. Helena stood and addressed the board with controlled fury. Gentlemen, We have clear evidence that specific interventions reduce yellow fever transmission by 40%. Whether the mechanism is mosquitoes, miasma, or divine intervention is less important than the fact that people are dying in areas we could protect but choose not to. How many more deaths will you require before acting on the data before you? Her directness shocked the room into silence. Women, especially female physicians, were not supposed to speak so forcefully in such settings, but her words cut through the political maneuvering and forced the board to confront the essential question: what level of proof was sufficient to justify action? Dr. Marchand, who had been cautiously supportive throughout, cleared his throat. I propose we expand the drainage and screening programs to all districts while Dr. Thornton continues his documentation. If the citywide results match the experimental findings, we will have our confirmation. If not, we will have at least improved sanitation, which benefits public health regardless. After more debate, the motion passed. Samuel was authorized to implement his interventions throughout New Orleans, with funding provided by the city and oversight by the Board of Health. It was a victory, but Samuel felt no triumph, only exhaustion and the weight of the lives already lost. The work of scaling up the interventions consumed the next month. Samuel recruited additional physicians and public health workers, trained them in his methods, and established systematic documentation procedures for every district in the city. The physical labor of draining ditches and distributing window screens fell to work crews, but the intellectual labor of maintaining rigorous records and ensuring consistent methodology fell to Samuel, Jacques, and Helena. Samuel pushed himself relentlessly, sleeping 4 hours a night, skipping meals, ignoring the persistent cough that had developed in early October. When Jacques expressed concern about his health, Samuel waved it off. We are in the middle of the most important public health intervention in the city's history. I can rest when the work is done. But the human body has limits that willpower cannot overcome. In late October, Samuel collapsed while inspecting drainage work in the Marigny neighborhood. One moment he was examining a recently cleared ditch and noting the absence of mosquito larvae. The next he was on his knees. The world spinning, his chest tight and his breath coming in shallow gasps. Jacques and Helena rushed him home and summoned Dr. Marchand, one of the few physicians Samuel actually respected. Marchand's examination was thorough and his diagnosis grim: pneumonia, advanced and complicated by exhaustion and malnutrition. Samuel's relentless work schedule had destroyed his body's ability to fight infection. You need complete bed rest for at least a month, Marchand said firmly. Your lungs are severely compromised. If you continue working in this condition, you will die, Samuel. It is that simple. Samuel tried to argue, but was seized by a coughing fit that left him gasping and weak. Helena took his hand, her expression fierce. We will continue the work. Jacques and I know your methods, your documentation standards. The intervention program will proceed, but you must rest or all your knowledge dies with you. It was the right argument to use. Samuel's greatest fear was not his own death, but dying before his work could make a lasting difference. He nodded weakly, surrendering to the necessity of recovery, even as his mind churned with concerns about maintaining data quality and ensuring consistent implementation. Jacques and Helena proved more than capable of managing the program. They coordinated the work crews, maintained the detailed records Samuel had established, and documented every new yellow fever case with the precision he had taught them. The interventions continued to show positive results. By November, new yellow fever cases had dropped by 53% compared to the previous year's numbers for the same period. Samuel recovered slowly in his bedroom on Dauphine Street, reviewing reports that Jacques brought daily and adding observations to his master journals when his strength allowed. He watched through his window as autumn finally brought cooler weather to New Orleans, as the mosquito populations died back with the approaching winter, as the epidemic that had terrorized the city for months gradually loosened its grip. In early December, Dr. Marchand visited to check on his progress and deliver unexpected news. Your work has attracted attention beyond New Orleans, Samuel. I received an inquiry from the Medical College of Virginia. They want you to present your findings and methodology at their annual symposium in March. Other cities are facing similar epidemics and want to know if your interventions can be replicated. Samuel sat up in bed, energized by the prospect despite his lingering weakness. My findings need to reach beyond New Orleans. If other cities implement these measures, we could prevent thousands of deaths. Then you had better finish recovering, Marchand said with a slight smile. The medical establishment needs to hear this from you directly. Your documentation is thorough, but your passion for the work is what will convince the skeptics. As Marchand left, Samuel looked at the stack of journals beside his bed. Years of careful observations transformed into evidence that could change medicine. His experiment had refused to remain confined to his laboratory or even to his lifetime. It was spreading, like the diseases he fought, but carrying prevention instead of death. He picked up his pen and opened the current journal. There was still so much to document, so much to understand. The work would never truly be finished, but perhaps that was the point. Each question answered revealed new questions. Each life saved was a vindication and a responsibility to save more. Outside his window, New Orleans was transforming. Work crews moved through the streets, draining ditches and removing standing water. Residents screened their windows and emptied their rain barrels. The city was learning slowly to fight an enemy it could barely see. And in a modest bedroom on Dauphine Street, a sick man documented it all, building a legacy that would outlive him by generations. By February 1851, Samuel had recovered enough to travel, though he would never regain his former vigor. The pneumonia had left permanent damage to his lungs, and he tired easily. But his mind remained sharp, and his determination unshaken. He spent his remaining strength preparing for the Virginia Symposium, organizing his documentation into a coherent presentation that would convince even the most skeptical physicians. Yellow fever had devastated New Orleans repeatedly throughout the 19th century, with major epidemics killing thousands, Webb 6. Samuel's detailed records from the 1850 outbreak represented the most comprehensive documentation of the disease's patterns that any American physician had assembled. He had case studies from over 300 patients, environmental data from 42 distinct neighborhoods, and statistical analysis showing clear correlations between standing water, mosquito populations, and infection rates. Jacques helped him prepare visual aids, large maps showing disease clustering, charts comparing infection rates between intervention and control districts, and timeline graphs demonstrating how drainage efforts correlated with reduced cases. Helena reviewed his presentation, challenging weak points in his argument and helping him anticipate objections from traditionalist physicians. "They will say correlation is not causation," Helena warned during one preparation session. "They will argue that the cooler fall weather, not your interventions, explained the decline in cases." Samuel nodded. "Which is why I have data showing the decline began in intervention districts 2 weeks before seasonal temperature changes would affect mosquito populations." "The timing matters, Helena. It shows our actions made the difference, not just natural seasonal variation." The journey to Richmond took 5 days by steamboat and rail. Samuel traveled with Jacques, bringing trunks filled with journals, maps, and carefully preserved specimens. The physical exertion of travel exhausted him, but he pushed forward, sustained by the knowledge that this presentation could transform public health practice across the American South. The Medical College of Virginia's symposium drew physicians from across the eastern states. Samuel's presentation was scheduled for the second day, in a large auditorium that seated 200. As he stood before the assembled doctors, he felt the weight of expectation and skepticism. These men represented the medical establishment, trained in traditional methods, invested in conventional wisdom. Medical practice in the mid-19th century was often based more on theory than empirical evidence, Webb 10. Samuel began by acknowledging this reality. "Gentlemen, I am not here to claim absolute certainty about disease mechanisms. I am here to present data showing that specific measurable interventions reduce yellow fever transmission. Whether my theoretical explanation is correct matters less than the fact that these methods save lives." He walked them through his methodology, explaining his documentation standards, his experimental design with control and intervention groups, and his statistical analysis. He showed them the maps, the correlations, the undeniable pattern of reduced mortality in areas where standing water had been eliminated. The audience's reaction was mixed. Some physicians leaned forward, fascinated. Others crossed their arms, faces set in disapproval. But all of them listened, and that was what mattered. Samuel was planting seeds that would grow long after he was gone, creating a foundation of evidence that future physicians could build upon. When he finished, the room erupted in questions, challenges, and debate. Samuel answered each inquiry patiently, always returning to the data, the documented observations that could not be dismissed through theoretical arguments alone. His experiment, his methodology, his meticulous records, they were beginning to spread beyond him, taking on a life of their own. The debate following Samuel's presentation lasted 3 hours. Dr. Harrison Blake from Boston Medical College stood and declared the mosquito theory fanciful speculation unsupported by established medical science. Dr. William Patterson from Charleston argued that Samuel's results could be explained by improved general sanitation rather than mosquito control specifically, making the insect hypothesis unnecessary. But younger physicians, those less invested in traditional practices, asked different questions. They wanted to know exact drainage specifications, screening materials, documentation methods. They saw not a threat to established wisdom, but a practical approach to a problem that had defied conventional solutions. Dr. Richard Chen, a physician working in Baltimore's immigrant neighborhoods, approached Samuel after the session. "I have observed similar clustering patterns near the docks where my patients live. Your methodology gives me a framework for testing whether the same interventions might work there. Would you be willing to share your documentation protocols?" Samuel spent the evening in his hotel room with a dozen physicians who wanted detailed information about implementing similar programs. He walked them through every aspect: how to organize systematic neighborhood surveys, how to maintain consistent record-keeping across multiple observers, how to establish control groups ethically while still providing basic care to all populations. "The documentation is everything," Samuel emphasized, his voice growing hoarse from hours of talking. "Without rigorous records, you cannot prove your interventions work. Without proof, you cannot convince authorities to fund expansion. Every case must be documented, every variable recorded, every outcome tracked." Jacques took notes during the discussion, documenting the questions asked and Samuel's responses. This too would become part of the permanent record, a guide for future public health practitioners. The knowledge was spreading through conversation, through shared methodology, through the practical application of Samuel's systematic approach. The symposium's final day featured a panel discussion on public health innovations. Samuel was invited to participate alongside prominent physicians from major eastern cities. The conversation ranged across various diseases and interventions, but repeatedly returned to Samuel's work as an example of how systematic observation could advance medicine more effectively than theoretical debates. Dr. Marchand, who had traveled from New Orleans to support Samuel's presentation, made a powerful statement during the panel. Dr. Thornton's methodology represents a fundamental shift in how we approach disease. Rather than arguing about theories we cannot test, he documented what actually happens when specific interventions are implemented. The medical profession needs more of this empirical approach and less reliance on untested assumptions. Not everyone agreed. Several physicians walked out during the panel, offended by what they perceived as attacks on legitimate medical wisdom. But the schism was already forming between those committed to traditional approaches and those willing to embrace evidence-based practice. Samuel's work had become a flashpoint in that larger transformation. The symposium concluded with resolutions calling for increased emphasis on systematic documentation and controlled experimentation in medical practice. It was not a revolution, but it was progress. Samuel returned to New Orleans exhausted, but satisfied that his methods would be tested in other cities, that the evidence base would grow beyond his individual contributions. On the journey home, Samuel suffered another severe respiratory episode. Jacques found him collapsed in their cabin, struggling to breathe, his lips tinged blue from oxygen deprivation. By the time they reached New Orleans, Samuel could barely walk. Dr. Marchand's examination confirmed what Samuel already knew. His lungs were failing progressively. He had months at best, perhaps only weeks. "I need to finish the documentation," Samuel told Helena and Jacques when they gathered in his bedroom. "Everything I have learned, all the protocols and methods, they need to be compiled into a comprehensive manual that others can follow. My observations are only valuable if they can be replicated." "Then that is what we will do," Helena said firmly. "You dictate, we will write. Nothing will be lost." Through February and into March, Samuel worked from his bed, organizing his life's research into systematic chapters that explained not just his findings, but his methodology, how to conduct systematic neighborhood surveys, how to establish control groups ethically, how to analyze statistical patterns, how to present findings to skeptical audiences. Every lesson he had learned, he transmitted to Jacques and Helena, who recorded it all with meticulous care. His experiment refused to die because he refused to let the knowledge die with him. By April, Samuel rarely left his bed. His body was failing, but his mind remained focused on ensuring his work would continue. Letters arrived regularly from physicians in Baltimore, Charleston, and Philadelphia, reporting their attempts to replicate his interventions. Some showed promising early results. Others encountered resistance from local authorities or struggled with documentation protocols. Samuel dictated responses to each letter, offering guidance and encouragement. The manual he had been compiling was nearly complete. Jacques and Helena had organized it into 12 chapters, covering every aspect of systematic disease investigation and intervention. They titled it Principles of Systematic Public Health Practice, Documentation and Methodology for Disease Prevention. It was dry, technical, and utterly revolutionary in its implications. "This is your legacy," Helena told him during one of their daily working sessions. Spring sunlight filtered through the window, warming the room but unable to warm Samuel's increasingly frail body. "Every physician who reads this will have access to methods that took you 20 years to develop. You are teaching them to see patterns, to think systematically, to trust evidence over tradition." Samuel smiled weakly. "I am teaching them to document. The patterns reveal themselves if you record enough observations carefully enough. That was always the secret, Helena. Not brilliance or insight, just relentless systematic documentation." News from the citywide intervention program continued to be encouraging. Yellow fever cases in the summer of 1851 were running 60% below the previous year, despite similar weather conditions, Webb 6. Other diseases showed no similar decline, suggesting the intervention specifically affected yellow fever, rather than producing general health improvements. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. But Samuel took little satisfaction in vindication. He thought instead about Catherine Morrison's son and the others who had died in comparison districts during his initial experiments. The utilitarian calculus that justified those deaths to gain knowledge still troubled him. Would the thousands saved in subsequent years balance the scales? Was such moral accounting even possible? "You did what was necessary to generate proof," Jacques said, when Samuel voiced these thoughts. "Without rigorous methodology, your observations would have been dismissed as anecdotal. The comparison districts were not denied care. They simply did not receive experimental interventions of unproven value. That is different from deliberate harm." "I know the arguments," Samuel replied. "I made them myself. But knowing something intellectually and feeling its rightness are different things. I will die with that burden, Jacques. Perhaps that is appropriate." Jacques had no answer for that. Some moral weights cannot be lifted through logical argument. In late April, Dr. Chen visited from Baltimore with promising news. His implementation of Samuel's drainage protocols had reduced yellow fever cases by 42% in the neighborhoods where he worked. He brought detailed documentation following Samuel's methodology, adding to the growing body of evidence that the interventions worked across different cities and populations. "Your manual saved me months of trial and error," Chen told Samuel. "Every question I had about implementation was answered clearly. You have created something that will benefit physicians and patients for generations." More visitors came in the following weeks. Physicians Samuel had met at the symposium, local health officials, even Alderman Beauregard, who awkwardly acknowledged that perhaps he had been too hasty in dismissing Samuel's theories. Samuel received them all graciously, though each visit exhausted him further. By mid-May, he could no longer dictate or receive visitors. He spent his final days in a morphine haze, occasionally surfacing to consciousness, where Helena or Jacques would be reading to him from letters arriving from cities across the country. Physicians implementing his methods, public health officials requesting copies of his manual, medical journals wanting to publish his findings. The knowledge was spreading like an epidemic itself, but one that healed rather than harmed. His systematic approach, his insistence on documentation, his methodology, they were being transmitted from physician to physician, city to city, generation to generation. The experiment he had begun in grief and obsession was refusing to remain contained, refusing to die even as he died. On May 23, 1851, with Jacques and Helena beside him, Samuel Thornton took his final breath. His last documented observation, written shakily in his journal 3 days before, read, "Patterns persist beyond individual observers. Truth survives its discoverers. Document everything." Samuel Thornton's funeral was attended by over 200 people, a remarkable number for a physician who had often been dismissed as eccentric during his lifetime. Colleagues from Charity Hospital, residents from the neighborhoods where his interventions had saved lives, physicians from other cities who had traveled to pay respects, they gathered to honor a man whose refusal to accept conventional wisdom had transformed public health practice. Dr. Helena Winters delivered the eulogy. Samuel saw patterns where others saw only chaos. He trusted evidence when tradition proved inadequate. Most importantly, he documented everything with such meticulous care that his insights could be replicated, tested, and built upon by others. That is the true measure of scientific contribution, not individual brilliance, but the creation of knowledge that transcends its creator. Jacques Beaumont inherited Samuel's extensive collection of journals and case studies. Over the following year, he worked with Helena to ensure the manual they had compiled was published and distributed widely. The medical establishment initially resisted. Established journals refused to publish work that so directly challenged conventional practices. But younger physicians and public health officials embraced the methodology eagerly. By 1854, Samuel's drainage and mosquito control protocols had been implemented in 17 cities across the American South and Caribbean. Yellow fever mortality rates dropped dramatically in areas that followed his systematic approach. The correlation between his methods and reduced disease transmission became impossible to deny, even for the most traditionalist physicians. The manual, Principles of Systematic Public Health Practice, went through 5 editions before 1860, each expanding on Samuel's original framework, with additional case studies and refinements. It became required reading in progressive medical schools, training a new generation of physicians to think systematically about disease prevention rather than relying solely on individual treatment, Web 7, Web 10. Jacques eventually earned formal recognition as a physician, though the color of his skin still barred him from many professional opportunities. He continued Samuel's work, documenting disease patterns and advocating for evidence-based interventions. He often spoke about Samuel's legacy. Dr. Thornton proved that careful observation and rigorous documentation could advance medicine more effectively than theoretical debate. His methods saved more lives after his death than during his lifetime because he ensured the knowledge could spread. Helena became one of the leading voices for systematic public health practice, leveraging Samuel's work to argue for expanded disease surveillance and preventive measures. She faced significant resistance as a female physician, but Samuel's documented evidence provided her with weapons that prejudice could not easily dismiss. She corresponded with public health pioneers across America and Europe, spreading the methodology that Samuel had pioneered. The full validation of Samuel's mosquito transmission theory came decades later. In 1881, Cuban physician Carlos Finley formally proved that mosquitoes transmitted yellow fever. In 1900, Walter Reed's famous experiments in Cuba provided definitive confirmation. Both cited Samuel Thornton's 1850 documentation as early evidence supporting the vector theory, acknowledging that his systematic observations had identified the pattern decades before the mechanism was fully understood. Samuel's journals, were eventually donated to the Medical College of Louisiana, where they became invaluable primary sources for researchers studying disease history and the development of epidemiological methods. Medical students still studied his case documentation as examples of systematic clinical observation. Public health courses taught his experimental design as an early model of controlled intervention studies. The man himself was gradually forgotten outside specialist circles, his name becoming a footnote in medical history books. But his methods, his insistence on documentation, his systematic approach to understanding disease, these became so thoroughly integrated into medical practice that their origin was no longer remarkable. The experiment had truly refused to die with him, becoming instead the foundation upon which modern epidemiology was built. In New Orleans, the neighborhoods where Samuel had first tested his interventions continued to benefit from regular drainage and mosquito control. The ditches he had mapped in 1850 were eventually replaced by modern sewage systems, but the principle remained. Systematic observation of disease patterns leads to effective prevention strategies. Catherine Morrison, the mother who had confronted Samuel about her son's death, lived to see yellow fever virtually eliminated from New Orleans by the early 20th century. In her final years, she acknowledged in a letter to Jacques that perhaps Samuel's terrible calculus had been justified by the thousands of children who grew to adulthood because of the knowledge his experiments had generated. "I will never forgive him," she wrote, "but I understand now what he was trying to accomplish." That perhaps captured the complexity of Samuel Thornton's legacy better than any eulogy. He had made choices that caused suffering in service of knowledge that prevented greater suffering. He had prioritized systematic understanding over individual salvation, betting that documented truth would save more lives than compassionate action informed by ignorance. The bet paid off. His experiment, the systematic documentation of disease patterns and rigorous testing of interventions, refused to die because he had built it to survive without him. Every life saved by mosquito control, every epidemic prevented through systematic public health measures, every physician trained in evidence-based practice carries forward the work that Samuel Thornton began in grief and completed in determination. The scientist who tried to cure death never found that cure. But he found something almost as powerful, a method for understanding disease that could be taught, replicated, and improved across generations. In the end, his experiment did not refuse to die with him. It transformed into something far greater than one man's obsession. It became the foundation of modern public health, saving millions of lives across centuries. That was the legacy that truly could not die. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.